So just by a show of hands today, how many families have already participated or intend to go upstairs to the third floor and donate blood or saliva samples? Wow, that's great. Well, first of all, give yourself a hand. And thank you for taking the time to then contribute and donate samples. It's very valuable for us in order to do genetic discovery and research. So I'm actually here on behalf of the Center for Applied Genomics, and what I want to do is just give you a little bit of a background of what the center does, and also give you a little bit of context of the types of things we're going to be doing with those samples and how they can actually aid in the discovery process into the underlying root of the disease for juvenile myositis, as well as lead to potential new treatments and diagnoses. So, by way of example, what we hope to do is just illustrate some success stories from the past where we've used this approach and that actually led to tangible and helpful real therapies for kids for other diseases, but we think that we can use the same approach here for juvenile myositis in order to drive new discoveries and potentially treatments as well. So the Center for Applied Genomics is part of the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, and the hospital itself is also part of this very rich and diverse biomedical ecosystem linked to the University of Pennsylvania. And a couple of recent discoveries in terms of medical therapy breakthroughs that may have heard about is the Spark Therapeutics, where they introduced a new gene therapy to cure an inherited form of childhood blindness, and so they were able to put in a corrective gene to these particular kids with this particular form of illness and essentially restore vision to kids who otherwise would have been blind for the rest of their lives. Another recent breakthrough was in the field of refractory leukemia and cancers, where they take immune cells from the patient's body, re-engineers, put in a new receptor on there, and then reintroduce that to then go after the leukemia and lymphoma cells. So these CAR-T therapies has been kind of now the new wave of cancer therapies that they're now introducing. It's been a very exciting time. So here at the Center for Applied Genomics, what we're mainly focused on are two things: is genetic discovery as well as biobanking, and the two kind of go hand in hand. I think probably the most relevant analogy you may have heard of is the All of Us or Precision Medicine Initiative that the NIH is currently running, where they're aiming to collect volunteers from about over 1 million Americans to then donate samples and then link to their medical information to monitor them long term, to then in order to aid in these kind of precision medicine approaches to then kind of tailor treatments based off of their genetics. So what we like to say actually at CHOP and at the Center for Applied Genomics is that this has actually already been happening for pediatrics for the last 10, 12 years before that. And it's already an ongoing process that we've implemented, in part from very, I think, forward-thinking vision from the people at CHOP, because about 15 years ago, they were one of the first early adopters of electronic health medical record systems, and they have about 50 satellite sites throughout the tri-state area around Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware, and we're one of the first ones to really implement link everything electronically through an electronic medical record system. And through that, they have about 1.3 million or so unique visits every year, with about 500,000 new people that are coming in. So the idea was, how do we harness that to also kind of aid in new research and discovery efforts as well? So then they hired actually our founding director, who currently runs the center right now as well. He's in that kind of the bottom right corner, Dr. Hauken Narson. Put in about $20 million as initial starter funds to then help create a genetic biobank and recruitment effort to then bring in people that come to visit through CHOP, and then create this biobank where we're not only just collecting samples, but we're also asking for the families and patients to then consent for us to then link their medical records to their genetic profile in order to aid in the discovery of the genetic roots and drivers of common pediatric diseases and conditions. And fortunately, he couldn't be here tonight. He actually has a good excuse. He's back in Iceland attending his daughter's wedding, so you get me instead, for better or for worse. So right now, this article was featured about 10 years ago, and this was an aspirational kind of article at the time where we were aiming to get about 100,000 unique children through this particular effort. And fortunately, I think as of about a year or so ago, we've reached that goal, and now with the continuing effort to then expand well beyond that as well. So at this stage, we are the largest pediatric biobank repository of its kind in the world, and not only is it's unique in that just the number of pediatric samples that are in there, but also the ability to actually have this rich information about their medical history through their electron medical records that really help to drive the ability for us to make new discoveries and do genetic research. And so this is just kind of a rough plot of how the biobank has expanded over the years. And this is a little bit outdated, it goes only up to 2012, but we're increasing the number of participants by many thousands of people per year. And on top of that, we get hundreds of thousands to this point from external collaborators as well from other institutions in order to kind of add to these kind of genetic studies, because a lot of times you need other samples and to kind of compare and contrast against, and also other projects to be able to do these kind of studies with the kind of depth that we need to. And just to kind of backtrack a little bit, the current biobanking capacity has around, it can handle up to about 10 million different samples. So even with about 400 plus samples to this, we're only at a drop in the bucket here in terms of our overall capacity. And the good thing about CHOP is that it is a very large referral centers for various type of pediatric conditions and disorders. And so if you notice on the bottom part where it's highlighted in red, we do have a very good representation of various kinds of rare orphan diseases and disorders as well. We're hoping to, through the collaboration with the foundation here with CureJM, to then expand our reach and emphasis into myositis. Currently there are kids here, but we hope that to be able to add to that in a significant way in the near future. And one thing that statistic is very, I think, telling is that because CHOP is such a large referral center, about 10% of all rare disease cases ends up funneling or channeling through CHOP at some particular point. So we have it's basically an epicenter for us to be very effective in recruiting samples and patients and families to study basically any kind of childhood disorders that you can think of. And so what's unique also about the way we're collecting samples and consenting is that, unlike a lot of other places where you give the sample in and that's pretty much it, just like for your ancestry information to 23andMe or Answers.com, it's hard to do anything in terms of driving discovery and research, because you don't, that DNA by itself without any context about what the person has, what their family history is, what their lab test results, is not very helpful. So because it's linked to the electron medical records, we have this ability to link into all this detailed information that can help compare and contrast to then see what genetic markers are associated with particular traits versus not. And on top of that, for those who do participate, it's been very valuable in that they also give us consent, not only to follow up longitudinally over time, so before and after their visits, anytime they do come back to CHOP, we can also access their records. And on top of that, they give us permission to then go back and recontact them in case there are new studies or new findings that could be of interest that they may wish to participate in the future. And I can't emphasize how valuable that is for us in terms of our research abilities. And the type of wealth of medical information that's available through electronic medical records is just astounding, in that rich source has been really the basis for our existence and our ability to make all these discoveries and do all this kind of research. And so what's also important is that CHOP, because it's in the middle of Philadelphia, we do get a very good representation of both of various ethnic groups, probably not all, but it's a very good representation of both Caucasian and as well as African American populations. So in terms of diversity, we're also one of the more diverse biobank collections in the world as well. And we are currently then collaborating with other broad biobank networks to try to then understand and work out how you can use electron medical records information and genetics to really help to then improve patient care. And this is part of this eMERGE network that the NIH has developed. And so in terms of actual translation then, how do you use this model in order to aid in the discovery of the cause of genetic diseases and also to aid in the discovery of potential new therapies? And I think just in interest in time, I'd probably just go through the first two examples here. One is neuroblastoma, and this is a very severe form of childhood nervous system cancer. So it affects the parasympathetic sympathetic nervous system. That's the kind of nervous system that regulates your kind of flight or fight response in your body. So then these kids have tumors that then grow while they're developing in those kind of in those nervous system cells. It's actually one of the most common solid tumor of infancy, and it's usually by the time it's caught is usually pretty severe, and it becomes metastatic. So even though it's even though it's rare, it is very lethal. And then among those, there's like 1% of kids whose family actually has a history of developing neuroblastoma. So those families were extremely important for us because with this very rich pedigree history, we can look at the inheritance and then do genetic linkage studies. And what we found immediately was that there was this locus that this trait is actually being passed along. And when you then drill down and look for a specific gene, what you come up with eventually is that it's a gene in this signaling pathway regulated by this protein called ALK, or anaplastic lymphoma kinase. At the time, Pfizer was actually developing a drug, Crizotinib or Xalkori, actually to target lung cancer. And with this discovery, the leadership at the time was able to reach out to them and actually have them reposition and do a clinical trial for neuroblastoma. And I think it remains to this day one of the fastest, if not the fastest, path from initial discovery to then approval for a drug of any drug, and especially certainly in cancer. So that was one of our early success stories. Another one I want to go over is actually a condition called general lymphatic anomalies. So in this case, what happens is that your body has mainly two main types of plumbing system. There's your circulatory system, which pumps your blood throughout your heart, your lungs, and all throughout the body. And the other one that's perhaps not as well known is the lymphatic system. And this basically drains a lot of the fluids and immune system and other kind of water and basically interstitial fluid that then otherwise is occupies throughout the space in your body. And there has to be some way to kind of regulate those fluids. Otherwise, you could get edema, you get things trapped at certain places, and it just otherwise, if it's not regulated, it can cause severe problems, like it does in this particular case. So in this particular type of disorder, your lymphatic plumbing is essentially rewired and completely dysregulated and malformed. And what we did was sequencing studies like we are doing with CureJ and families right now, and what we found was a mutation in this gene called ARAF that regulates a pathway called the MAP kinase signaling pathway. Turns out there are actually drugs developed already to target cancer, to treat cancer for this specific pathway in particular. And what you can see from this 12-year-old boy who had a very severe form of GLA or lymphatic abnormality, if you kind of just focus on the very last top right-hand slide. So if you see his legs there, it had basically expanded to double the size of what it normally should be. And not only that, these fluids were also accumulating in his lungs and also preventing him from breathing properly. He had to be aspirated, and he basically just was on bed rest for months because traditionally it wasn't thought that GLA was a genetic disorder. And on top of that, the treatments for it was primarily rapamycin, and none of that had been very effective. And so with this discovery, they then immediately changed him over to this MAP kinase inhibitor called Trametinib. And then within a couple of months, if you look at the bottom right corner, all that swelling basically went down. And all the swelling also, the fluid accumulation in the lungs also disappeared. And then now his FEV and his other lung functions then restored to normal within like 2-3 months. And now he's walking to school again on his own, under his own power, and without any support, and otherwise now living, his life returning back to normal to what it was before he was affected. So I think just for interest of time, we'll kind of skip over the other two cases, but just to say that there are other instances where we can use this kind of approach also for other types of more common childhood disorders like attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, as well as also inflammatory bowel disease, which is basically an autoimmune-like condition that affects your GI tract. And what we hope to do, and in both of those cases, the genetic discoveries then led directly to a idea for a therapy, which we then either licensed or outsourced, or through some means then also eventually are now doing ongoing clinical trials to then test it in those particular two diseases. And what we hope to do then is to use the same type of approach for juvenile myositis, and that's why we've been reaching out to the families here to then collect these samples, and hopefully within the next year or so we'll be able to come back and then share some similar types of stories then as well in terms of advancements in our research. Thank you.